Well, of all the episodes in the life of Elijah, this is probably the most troublesome one to understand because there really isn't anything else like it in the Old Testament. In our text, Elijah lays himself out over the body of a dead child, and the boy comes back to life. And yet it's not exactly like the story of Jesus' resurrection on Easter morn, where he is surrounded by angels in a sense of glorious triumph. And it doesn't even carry the same feel as when Jesus walked up to the cave where Lazarus had been buried, and he says, "Lazarus, come forth." No, this takes place in an upper chamber in a very private place. Because the story is so unusual, I have to admit some people have discounted it as a myth. They see it as kind of a folk story, maybe a fairy tale. Some critical scholars suggest that either the boy wasn't really dead or that this event never really happened at all. So before we examine this passage more closely, I want you to know my bias. I firmly believe the facts of what the Bible says. I think the widow's son did die. I think Elijah stretched out his body over the boy's body in some form or fashion as he prayed. And I think God heard Elijah's prayer, and the boy's life returned to him. But I do acknowledge the emotional difficulties because this text should raise some questions for you. I know it did for me. If God can do this, why doesn't he do it all the time? And that's a great question, I think, because I don't know how you can deal with this story without coming to grips with some of the great mysteries of God that are displayed in his sovereignty, his mercy, and his grace that results in what God eventually does and doesn't do. So we'll look at that in just a moment. But let's a little reminder of where we've been for the past 2 weeks. In the past 2 weeks, did you notice that the plans seem to go accordingly? 2 weeks ago, after Elijah prophesied to Ahab that there would be no rain except by my word, there was no rain. And God promised to provide Elijah food by means of ravens and water in a wadi. And ravens promptly and regularly appeared with food, and a wadi provided water. And we say to ourselves, yes, that's our mighty and powerful God at work. And then last week began when the Lord tells Elijah to go and live in Zarephath, the smelting pot, where God has commanded a widow that he doesn't even know to feed him. The widow says that she has no food, but Elijah proclaims God promises that her oil and her meal will not run out. Again, as predicted, the oil and the meal containers replenish daily. And we say to ourselves, yes, that's our mighty and powerful God at work. In other words, we can believe in God when we think God is doing what he ought to do. But what happens when things don't go exactly as planned? Suddenly in verse 17, it appears that things are not going according to plan. The widow's son falls ill. There's no breath in him. It looks as if the boy has been saved from starvation for maybe a few weeks or a few months, only to die of a severe illness? Don't you want to ask God, God, why are you doing this? Further frustration comes when there's no explanation from the Lord in the text. There's no explanation for the boy's illness, nor is there any authoritative word on how the event figures into God's plans. And we back to our motto, expect the unexpected. This unexpected turn leaves both the widow and Elijah searching for an explanation. The widow's reaction is to turn to Elijah and to get angry at Elijah. What man of God saves a mother and a son from starvation only to allow the son to die of starvation or die of a severe illness in the near future? I remember a couple who attended the church of which I pastored in Florida. Always happy, always positive, always bubbly, there every Sunday, in the same pew, in the same seat. Then unexpectedly, the husband died. And the woman responded with anger and grief. Why did God do this to me? We were so faithful. My husband was a good man. It's not fair. And the woman actually left the church. She was so mad at the pastoral staff. She was particularly mad at me, and she blamed me for her husband's death. I wonder if the mother in this case, in 1 Kings 17, when she says, man of God, does she say it with sarcasm dripping from her lips? If her son dies, then Elijah and his God, in spite of all the miraculous oil and flour replenishment, are powerless. God, let my boy die. Or perhaps she thinks Elijah is powerful, but he's pulled a cruel prank on her. Perhaps this trick with the bottomless oil jug was part of a terrible setup in which she is given hope only to have it torn away, designed to punish her for her mercilessly for her sins, and that is what God is doing, punishing her. No, that's not true. If truth be told, Elijah seems shocked actually by this turn of events. Elijah, you notice this week, doesn't say, do not worry, like he did last week. It's all part of God's plan. He doesn't even try to defend God. God wouldn't do such a thing. He simply says, give me the boy. Then Elijah takes the boy. And I wonder, how did he do it? Did the woman willingly release the boy's body to Elijah? Or did Elijah grab the boy out of her arms? I don't know. But I do know that he took the boy to the upper room, his private chamber, the guest room. There he had a private word with God, and I don't think Elijah kept his cool. Behind closed doors, he protests. He prays fervently, boiling, like boiling water. What are you doing, God? You bring me to stay with this widow who has nothing and makes me rely upon her hospitality, and then you thank her by killing her son? Face it, Elijah is upset. He doesn't understand. God's ways can be mysterious, but Elijah, he's going to put his foot down right now. Do what you want to me, but don't let this young boy die. Elijah does not simply reiterate or obey God's words as he has done so up until now. Instead of waiting and listening for God's response, the all-powerful divine word, he performs what appears to be some sort of sympathetic magic, stretching himself out on the child 3 times. Now, what is that all about? I don't know. Then he boldly commands God to let this child's life come into him again. Now, the NRSV, which we read moments ago, translates this in a way that softens Elijah's words to God. Let this child's life come into him again. But, you could just as legitimately translate the words, my God, return this child's life to him. I don't know which way he prayed. Elijah's off-the-cuff, completely unplanned action causes what? A response from God, and the boy revives. Now, in the context of this narrative, now I expect a mulligan. Now I expect a divine answer. Maybe a narrator's commentary on why all this went down. Just some words that communicate somehow that this resurrection miracle was part of God's plan from the beginning, that God thought this would be a great way to prove that he's more powerful than Baal, he's more powerful than death. Silence. Nothing. That is not where the text goes. Instead of tying up the loose ends, we hear that the boy is saved because God listened to the voice of Elijah. That's what it says in verse 22. This is surprising because on the surface, all the events of Elijah's life seem to be about the power of God's words. It is a story about getting people to listen to God's voice. And yet at this pivotal moment in the narrative, the tide turns because God now listens to Elijah's voice. The boy's breath returns to him because God recognizes the truth in Elijah's protest. And in turn, God does something that God has never done in the Hebrew Bible up until this point. God undoes death. This is literally the first resurrection occurrence in the Bible. Scholars argue, therefore, about whether the boy was really dead. Maybe he was just close to death. Admittedly, the text doesn't say definitively. And of course, it is easier to believe that the boy had not died, right? If the boy did indeed die, then the Bible is entering uncharted territory. The notion of resurrection is an unheard of experience throughout history up until this point in time. The writers are hesitant, therefore, because they are trying to describe tentatively and cautiously something that is unprecedented. And in this moment of crisis, in response to the truth of Elijah's words, God mobilizes the power of life and does something that God has never, ever done before. God attends to this seemingly small thing. I mean, it's a poor boy. Nobody even knows he exists except his mother. Boy is not John McCain. With an enormous act of reversal, God pulls a resurrection out of the hat. Then the story ends this way. When the widow sees her son revived in Elijah's arms, she proclaims, "You are a man of God. The word of the Lord in your mouth is truth." Elijah does not argue, but the reader knows that while her interpretation may be accurate, it does not capture what happened in that upper room. The boy's life returns because God recognized that the word of Elijah was true. These events teach me that it is very easy for us to become complacent in the midst of the blessings of God. We secretly begin to think everything's perfect. I mean, I've got life all figured out. My marriage is good. My kids are good. My grandkids are good. I love my life. I love my church. Everything in my life is exactly where I want it to be. Hey, listen, if that happens to be your situation this morning, don't feel bad about that. If your life is good, you ought to enjoy it. And you ought to be profoundly grateful to God. But know these two things for certain. You don't deserve the blessings. They're God's gifts to you, and they aren't going to last forever. They never do. Soon enough, the clouds move in and rain begins to fall. Now listen, I don't mean that you should live in fear of the next tragedy, but you ought to be wise enough to know that after every sunrise, there's a sunset. After every high noon, there's a dark midnight. Always has been, always will be. And after the time of God's blessing, you see disaster strikes. Did you notice how it went? There was the testing, there was the blessing, and there was the sorrow. It kind of seems backwards. Wouldn't it make more sense if there was sorrow, and then there was testing, and then there was blessing? We always like a good ending. But God works differently. Testing, blessing, sorrow. It's so easy to be lulled into false thinking. Oh, we made it through the hard times. Now it's going to be smooth sailing from here on out. That's not always God's design for us. As I read the text, the question comes to mind that I cannot answer. When the child first became ill, where was Elijah? I mean, was he there? Had he been praying for this sick boy for days, weeks, months, or did he just appear? I assume the answer is yes, that he's been praying, but the Bible doesn't say. And I have a further question. When the child died, why did Elijah do what he did? And the only answer I can come up with is he got involved because he saw God in everything. He saw God in the good times, yes, but he saw God in the bad times as well. Do you? I find Elijah's response very instructive when the mother, in anger and despair, accuses Elijah of coming to her house just to kill her son. Notice what he did? He doesn't get angry at the woman for accusing him. He doesn't try to explain why her son died. He doesn't argue with her. He doesn't make excuses for God. He responds with incredible gentleness. There's no easy way to explain what happens next. Elijah lays down on top of the body of the boy. Now, I don't know, did he lay down, foot to foot, leg to leg, chest to chest, arm to arm, hand to hand, face to face? That's the way I often see it depicted. Or was he just so caught up in the prayer that he just kept falling down on the boy? He did it once, he did it twice, he did it 3 times. I have no idea why Elijah did what he did. We all do strange things under pressure, don't we? And as a side note, since the boy was dead, you have to realize that he's now unclean according to Jewish law. It was wrong for a prophet of God to touch a dead body, but extreme cases call for extreme measures. And so by lying down on the body of the child, Elijah might be saying, "Oh Lord, take some of the life that is within me and give it to this boy, please." He prayed for a miracle because he believed in a power greater than death. Now, I don't know much about Elijah's prayer posture, in this case, but there are some noteworthy features of Elijah's prayer of which we are told. He went to his private chamber where he could be alone with God. He prayed fervently. He relied on his personal experience, calling the divine, "My God." He recalled God's sovereignty in the child's death. He prayed earnestly and persistently. He appealed to God's tender mercy towards this poor widow, and he made a definite request: let this boy's life return to him. And then I ask, well, how did Elijah learn to pray like that? Where is the precedent in the Bible prior to Elijah for anybody praying this way? Before this moment, no one had ever been brought back from the dead. Enoch walked with God and was taken directly into heaven. Moses died. They didn't find his burial spot, but that doesn't mean that they were raised from the dead. But when Elijah prayed, he submitted himself completely to God. In himself, the prophet had no power to bring this child back to life. He doesn't demand anything from the Lord, nor does he name it and claim it. He humbly asked God, let this boy's life return to him. That was as much as he could do. The rest was up to God. James 5:17 says Elijah was a man with a nature like ours. He had the same fears, the same doubts, the same worries, the same concerns. What does James say that Elijah did? He prayed fervently. He prayed like boiling water. Can you think of a time when you prayed like boiling water? I can many times. My wife's been through several surgeries. I'll tell you, during those surgeries, I prayed like boiling water. Oh, God, please, please, Jesus, please, please help her to live. Please, Jesus, please, God, please. It doesn't sound like much, but I'll tell you what, that's probably the most real prayer that we'll ever pray. A boiling prayer. And James tells us the boiling prayers of the righteous avail much with God. And what's a boiling prayer? It has nothing to do with standing or sitting, kneeling or lying. It has nothing to do with lifting your voice or speaking in a whisper. It has nothing to do with how loud or how long your prayers are. When you take your son, you take your daughter, or you take your wife into surgery, you'll discover what a boiling prayer is. It's what happens when you pray like nothing else in the world really matters. And that's how Elijah prayed. And when the Bible says the Lord heard Elijah's cry, it means that when he stretched himself out on that boy's dead body, something happened. God spoke from heaven and he said, all right, man, it shall be done. And the application is simple. Pray like that and you will see heaven open on your behalf. Will it bring somebody back to life? Maybe, maybe not. What it'll do is it will grab God's attention and God will provide an answer. Remember that woman I told you about in Florida? She got so angry at me. So angry she wouldn't even let one of the pastors, including me at her church, do her husband's funeral. Well, a couple of months later in our house, there was a torrential downpour overnight and our kitchen roof leaked. I remember Michael coming into the bedroom and said, Mom, Dad, it's raining in the kitchen. Whoa. The contractor who repaired the kitchen was a Christian who got to talking about our churches. He loved his church, I loved my church, and then it dawned on me. His church was 2 blocks down from where that woman lived. And I took a chance. I called her up. I said, hey, I know we let you down. You should try out this church. I met this man. He sounds like a really good guy. I didn't know if she'd take the suggestion or not. About 4 years went by. Got a call in Lincoln, Nebraska. We were about a week from moving, and I was in the Albertsons just getting a few things when this woman came up to me. I didn't recognize her. She had changed her hairdo, changed her clothes. She looked good. She said, you don't recognize me, do you? And I wasn't really sure. But it was the woman whose husband had died. She says, I'm so glad I bumped into you. The church you recommended worked out great, and I want to apologize. I blamed you for my husband's death when I was really at that time mad at God. At the time, you were the physical representation of God for me. And a few months after you recommended that church, I went into my bedroom and I had an all-night conversation. I think she had a boiling prayer conversation with God. And I let God know how I felt. And in the morning, I felt at peace. Because God assured me that my husband was with him and that even in that tragedy, God had made all things new. Elijah had the great joy of returning the son alive to the mother. The body that was so heavy as he carried it up the stairs to the upper room was absolutely no burden to him in the return trip to a mother whose groans of sorrow had turned into shouts of joy. God had turned her doubt and her emptiness into faith and fullness, and she gave witness to her faith in God and his word. Sometimes we weep and question God, but when we center our life on Jesus, the one who died and came back to life for our sake, we begin to see God's plan to replace our tears and our sorrows with testimonies of faith and joy. Amen.